The same applies to space. Musical space has been fixed in the traditional Western music. Since musicians are no longer running through the woods and sitting on a stage, on chairs even, the function of space is, as we say, neutralized in music. Some conductors make, because of instrumentation, a difference in putting the cello at the left side compared to another conductor putting the cello at the right side in an orchestral piece, but that has no real revealing function. It doesn't move, it's fixed. All it has to serve is to clarify the music as being a static object in space. We also must say that because of the modern way of living, it is not it has, well, until the very recent situation in traffic, no longer been very important to identify clearly a sound which comes from the rear left, let's say 270 degree. If I call the circle 360 degree like someone who is on a ship, or a sound which comes from, let's say, north 215 and 45. That means the sound comes from there, rather than coming from there, which is south 270 minus 50 or minus 40. Which means we have always that one perspective. And then we sit in the concert hall on one chair, which is determined, or has been determined up to now by our money. And, well, with little variations, I would say. And there we are, which means the whole concert has this perspective. Well, I discussed a lot with my technicians in the studio about 1953 if it would be wise to put musicians on a chair and swing them around, for example. And then he said they might object, really. So then we thought it would be perhaps necessary to let them play into microphones and connect the microphones to speakers and then swing the speakers around. Then they would perhaps not object, but they objected too. Because they said, oh no, you can't do that with me, I'm here, and the sound has to come from here. The identification of this, well, we are no birds, that's the problem. If we were birds, naturally, we would not argue that way. We are just very clumsy and sitting, and most of the people can't even stand during the concert, so they must sit. Perspective is frozen, spatially. And that led to a music in which the movement and the direction of sound in space has no function. But the moment we discover the means to move the sound with any given speed in any given auditorium or even in a given space outdoors, there's no reason any longer, not only no reason, but there is the end of the fixed perspective. And relativity enters as well as in the other parameters into the composition of movement and speed of sound in space. And it becomes as important as the composition of its melodic lines, which means the changes of the pitches, or as its rhythmic characteristics, the changes of the durations. Which means that if I have a constant sound and a constant spectrum, and nothing changes in traditional terms, but just the sound makes, then this movement gives the sound a characteristic parameter, as we say, compared to another one, which is just in one direction. Or if I go over here, you see how it changes. And changing rightwise, clockwise or counterclockwise, or being at the left side, in the rear or in the front, or alternating like in a dialogue between rear left and front right, etc. These are all configurations in a space which are as meaningful as intervals in melody and harmony. So since that time I begin to speak and to compose and to find a notation of and for melodies in space, which means going up or down in space, or describing a certain configuration in a given space with a certain speed. And the extreme of this concept I have reached happily and with a lot of diplomacy, I must say, 2 years ago at the World Fair in Osaka in Japan. I collaborated with an architect and I had the chance to realize an object which I described in 1956. It is a spherical hall seating 600 people on a platform in the middle, which is sound transparent and light transparent. The people come up on rolling stairs, and then they can sit down wherever they want. There are cushions. The Japanese like this. And then there is a grid, a metal grid, and then there are speakers all the way around, which means 10 circles from the bottom. No, excuse me, 7 circles in that auditorium, from the bottom to the top. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 in the zenith. And then 10 rows vertically. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. 1, 2, 3, 4 to 10. At any point now in this pattern can be a sound source for any singer, player, or for a sound which is on tape. So all the singers, the soloists, they were in a kind of bird nests, also in a circle. 6 there were, or on the platform itself in the center, wherever they were situated, singers, players. And they were singing always into microphones. And then the sound reached a mixing table where myself or one of my assistants was sitting. And then I had constructed a sound mill which permits, with 1 input and 10 outputs, to move the mill in any direction with any speed up to the limits of my hand, which means about 5 revolutions per second. That's very fast. Then the sound makes 5 times in a second. In any configuration, let's say I would determine now with a push-button system, I had 7 outputs of that table, reaching to any speaker. Let's say this voice I want now for the next 2 or 3 minutes to go in a spiral movement. This voice, whenever he does, or the other way around. And then another player goes at the same time in a circle in this, with a second sound mill. And another one, just with 2 potentiometers, does this kind of movement. So we have, how can you say, a polyspatial composition. This can be improvised or it can be determined. But, I mean, we improvised it because we had a wonderful time, 183 days, every day for 6.5 hours, to play with these things, you see. It was wonderful. And the Japanese would come in, you see, they are very polite. Sure. And sit down, for example. And then it would start, the lights would go off. It was very beautiful. Wherever was a speaker, there was a little light with 5 bulbs, and it looked like a sky but a very geometrically composed sky of stars. I would sit, then they saw the singer. I announced the singer in English. It was translated by a hostess into Japanese. The lights went off. So now you hear Mr. So-and-so playing a duo with Mrs. or Miss So-and-so, etc. And then it would start. And then they would see. You saw in the hall, I could always see it from the control desk. They would say, and then would go like this, and then the other way. Etc. So even if they had never heard new music, that was exotic stuff, as their music is exotic stuff for us. Nevertheless, new music, old music, little importance. What is important is that when they went out. And I was very happy. If you discover something really new, what concerns the experience of man, I mean, there's no discussion. It's just, that's the way it is. And all the rest is minor talk about little details. But that was important. It was a new experience. Well, it was a wonderful thing. They destroyed it afterwards, as stupid as these organizations are. And I tried to get it to Europe. It was not very expensive, I must say. Really not. It was made with a plastic skin, and the construction was made like they construct nowadays these scaffoldings for building houses, etc. It's very well made, and it worked. Acoustically, fantastic, I must say. Everybody said a sphere never sounds well. You have bouncing sounds which go up and down. It sounded wonderful. No problem. Very good acoustics. Good reverberation time. Everything was fine. And I think one day I will get it again. Certainly. It is such an important experience that for the first time in history, the sound moves in a controlled way around man, and you are in the center. Even with earphones, I recommend earphones actually, as long as you don't have good auditoriums. Take earphones to listen to this music where the movement of sound becomes very important. Then it moves within you, and the head becomes this sphere. And with a little imagination, you can blow up this sphere to any size. What I want to add to this concept, new concept, which, for example, I cannot show you, I have a 2-channel tape recorder. This thing there. And I have put it on 4 speakers in the 4 corners. 1 channel here, 1 channel there. Even the rotations that are in the original and all these movements, the sound going up the walls, coming down the walls, etc., in certain configurations, and then going in spirals up and down, I can't really make them here. We did last night in London. There we had a 4-channel machine and a fairly good setup in Royal Festival Hall of speakers in a square. And then you can approximate very well the rotational movements and all the diagonal movements in space. Otherwise it becomes 2-dimensional, like a 2-dimensional visual object. And the 3rd dimension comes with the crossing of the sounds in a given space. I wanted to add to this the concept of reaching depth. The multi-layered spatial composition means the following, that not only the distance of the sounds remains constant in a circular or any a spherical movement around the listener, but that a sound can move away as far as we can imagine and come extremely close to the listener. And these are completely different characteristics, so I'm very careful when I say that up to now I have reached only 6 layers superimposed in front of each other acoustically, and that it is very difficult to add more layers. And the next example will show this. You hear these sounds which we heard last in the previous example and which are in the forefront and very dense, noisy. They cover the whole range of audibility, and nothing can pierce through this wall of sound, so to speak. And then I stop it all of a sudden, and you hear a 2nd layer of sound, and you become aware, it was already there, but I wasn't aware of it. You hear it, and then this stops again. I cut it like with a knife, and then you hear another layer. I cut it again, you hear another layer, which is in the back. Which means this depth, the spatial depth in several layers permits us to compose naturally perspectives from close to far, as we traditionally compose in a 2-dimensional harmonic and melodic field. This is really a very important thing. It's nothing new. I mean, it happens everywhere in nature. It's very important if I hear that the car is still far away, or if I hear it's just 2 feet away, I will behave differently. Well, in music, people think it doesn't matter, but beware. I mean, if the sound comes very close, it has the same effect on our electric system. And I play now this example, and you might determine yourself how many layers you are able to hear. It ends with an enormous breakout, many little particles acoustic particles fly around and they go away very far. Why is this a typical characteristic of electronic music? Why has it not been already in a Mahler symphony where he says the trumpets should blow outside of the hall? Naturally it has, but it was fairly primitive. Because playing soft or loud is not all of it. It is part of it. But imagine that someone is whispering very softly, very close to your ear, and a thunderstorm or a rocket is going up about 10 miles away. Then you're still aware that the whispering is very soft, but it's close. Whereas the rocket is extremely loud, but it's very far. And you are aware of the fact that it is very far. Now, two things are necessary, naturally, in such a composition is that we know what we are hearing. If we have never heard a sound before, we don't know if it's far or close. We must have heard it in the context of the music several times in order to know how it sounds when it sounds closer or further away. And there is something now very important about our concept of perception. Our concept of perception dates back, as you all know in the meantime, to Mr. Gutenberg. Which means, since we write, we are verticalized, and since we write, everything has become visualized and visual. The truth, the concept of truth, of perception, is entirely built on the visual. It has led to the incredible situation where nobody believes someone else if he doesn't sign it. And you know, all the fields of our social life are based on the visual. It must be proved visually. What you cannot see, most of the people do not believe. And this leads us to the very strange statement of most of the people when a sound in a given hall is moving away very far and coming close, then they say, well, that's an illusion. It has been technically made possible because nowadays they have the means to make the sound as if it were far, they say, as if. Which means they distort it to such a degree that it sounds like a sound which has been produced far away, reflected by the leaves of the trees, by the walls, and reaches my ear only indirectly, having been broken. And by that it becomes, as we say, distorted. It has noise factors. Naturally, we can produce these noise factors artificially. On the other hand, the sound which reaches me directly comes as direct as possible from the sound source to my eardrums. The closest, naturally, with earphones. It's the closest possible sound. And the unreflected sound also can be produced artificially. There, they have found the means to make the as if possible, they say, that it sounds as if it were very far or as if it is very close, with the combination of dynamics, intensity, plus degree of distortion. The purer the sound, the closer it is, and also, we must say naturally, in an absolute sense, the louder it is, the closer it is. The combination of dynamics and degree of distortion give that impression of far or close. And we can do this synthetically, naturally. We don't need to run 3 miles away in order to give to a certain sound the characteristic of a sound that in life, in nature, seems to be 3 miles away. Now I come to my point. When now in this new music, where the many layers of sound, one behind the other, occur, then most of the listeners cannot even perceive it because they say, well, the walls have not moved. So it is an illusion. Well, and then I say, the fact that you say the walls have not moved is an illusion. Because you have clearly heard that the sound went away very far. And that is the truth. And it is very doubtful if the walls have not moved or not. That's even had nothing to do with this perception. Which means that we absolutely believe in what we hear as much as formerly we believed in what we see or saw. They see, they open their eyes, and they say, aha, well, no, there are the walls, so that was an illusion. The sound has not really moved away. There you are. Think about this. That makes it so difficult for new music to be really perceived, because there's a block in most of the people. They say it is as if, or they can't even perceive it. Because they can't imagine, they can't separate themselves from the imagination someone, a bird or a car, must go 3 miles away before I can hear a sound 3 miles away. So they identify the sound with an object that must be in a given space away for a certain distance. And that's what we are struggling with, and that's what changes man naturally one by one if such music is more and more perceived in its real conditions. Just as, how can I say, a beginning of your own discoveries, I say these things and I cannot follow them up tonight. I play now the next example, and please listen to this excerpt of KONTAKTE under the perspective, and only under the perspective, of the multi-layered sound composition. How many layers you can hear, how a certain background, what we call a background, becomes a background because a little figure which sounds like craws, R, it makes 2 or 3 times, and which is very close, makes that background be more even than it would be alone, sound like a background, and on the foreground we have these clear figures, which are more dry, as we say in sound, less reflective, etc. And then it ends, as I said, with this explosion in a closed space. It sounds like in an echo chamber, and it is in an echo chamber. Being far away in a closed room or being far away in a park is totally different. Can we switch off the light? The equality of tones and noises in electronic music has been made clear already by discussing the continuous transition from periodic to more or less aperiodic waves, sound waves. If the degree of aperiodicity of any given sound can be controlled, and controlled in a continuous way, then any constant sound can be transformed into a noise. And the noise is determined by a certain width, as we say, a frequency band. And the widest band goes over the whole range of audibility. We call it usually, as I said several times, the white noise. But that's not all of it, because the density, or as we might say, the energy in a given sound is must also be considered in a given noise. Even if the width of a frequency band is the same for several noises, then the degree of presence, the energy, might be quite different. And I can simply say the means are available nowadays, the electronic means, all sorts of filters or modulators, to transform steady sounds into what we call aleatoric. It comes from alia, the dice. Aleatoric sound textures. That's the technical term. We speak about aleatoric sounds, which are more or less aleatoric when we want to define noises more or less precisely. Now, if this has become possible, the continuum between tones and noises, then complete new questions come up when we compose or play intuitively, which means on the spot in a group of players, new music, because we have no experience whatsoever in dealing with balances between sounds and noises, tones and noises. In traditional Western music, the noises were taboo, literally excluded, and that had very precise reasons, because it started from the moment on when they began to notate the sounds with intervals, precise intervals. It was mainly vocal music. And vocal music, as it says, mainly sung with vowels rather than with consonants, with voiceless consonants, which means we have no music, which composed music, which is composed in a way that, let's say, if I do this, then they say that's no music. Because there you see how narrow our concept of music is. The consonants were excluded. The noises were excluded. They might happen at the end of a given vowel in order to make the word understood. In our daily language, we have all the consonants in order to clarify the meaning of certain acoustic events. But in music, they had no function, just accents, yes, or it, to end clearly a sound, or ta, to start a sound very clearly. But the integration of the noises of all sorts has happened only since the middle of the century. And mainly, I must also say, through the discovery of new methods to compose this so-called continuum between tones and noises. Now, any noise is musical material. And one chooses for a given composition among this complete set of different degrees of noises and tones in a given scale, or in a scale that is determined by the composer. The balance between tones and noises is not at all a numerical one, which means when I want to finish off, like in KONTAKTE, with a situation which balances out the tones and noises. In the example you just heard before, I said we have reached the extreme of noisiness. And in the moment we started with, we had the extreme of clear pitched tones because we wanted to follow the melodic line of that tone. Now I want to deal with the whole scale of timbres between aleatoric and periodic ones, and I certainly cannot use as many noises as tones, because noises tend to cover up, to blur, and they are more primitive, so to speak. One has to be much more careful if one wants to establish balance between the two in a given section. One must reduce extremely the number of noises as compared to the number of tones. And there we are really discovering complete new principles of musical articulation. For example, in this particular work, I have worked with 42 different scales. If you don't know what that means, a piano is one scale, which means you have the half-tone scale. An octave is subdivided into 12 equal steps. Now imagine you have 42 different ones, the octave being divided into 13, 15, 17, 23 steps, etc. And I have used a scale of scales, where the degree of proportion from one scale to another one is constant. And then I have bound a particular scale to a particular family of tones or noises which I have used. Just to say it simply, the noisier the sounds which I have used, the noisiest were 2 octaves wide noises, with a band of 2 octaves wide in KONTAKTE. For them, the scale was the largest and most simple scale in KONTAKTE, only fifths, major fifths. So over the whole range of audibility, I could compose a noise which has 2 octaves wide only 11 times. That was it. 12, as you know, 12 fifths make about the range of an octave. But the more narrow the sound was, the more it approached the pure tone, the finer the scale. This is the principle I have used. As a one-to-one relationship, when I use a certain family of noises or sounds, I used a certain scale. Because I found out that with the purest tones, you can make this most subtle melodic changes, which are much, much smaller than what you read in books, that they say 80 to 81 is the smallest interval we can hear. That's not true at all. We can hear much smaller intervals if we use sine waves. And if the sine waves are not broken, but if I do it in little glissandi, so that I can really feel that little change. The micro tones, as we say, go much far beyond of what we are taught about the old Chinese system, or of what you read in physics, in books of physics or perception. But it depends on the tone. You cannot just say any tone can be used in any interval relationship. There you are. We discover new laws of relationship between the nature of the sound and the scale with which we compose the sound. So harmony and melody are no longer abstract systems which are filled with any given sounds that we find as material, but there is a very, very subtle relationship nowadays between form and material, and I would even go so far that form and material have become one. That is the most important event, to my opinion, in the 20th century, that in several fields you cannot split any longer the material from the form and say I use this material and put it into that form, but that a certain given material finds its own and its best form. It has its inner tendency to come into its best form, so to speak. Material and form become one, and the forming is automatically based on the research of the characteristics of a given material. And it's no longer an abstract concept, form or material, of matter and form. The old dialectic based on the antinomy between or dichotomy between form and matter has really disappeared since we produce electronic music, and we become aware of the nature of the sound itself and its relativity. I play now the last section of KONTAKTE, and you might judge yourself if in that section I have achieved what I tried to achieve, a balance between tones and noises, between sound events that have clear pitch and melodic lines and noises which have a less precise melodic lines and have this band characteristic and the cover effect, etc. I play now the end of KONTAKTE, and we switch off the lights again, and as I said before, try to follow the many lines and the many layers as much as possible, because I'm sure you will not hear this sort of music so soon again. Switch off the lights. I have tried to clarify 4 criteria of electronic music and the composition of electronic music. The first one was the unified time structuring. The second one, the splitting or the decomposition of the sound. The third one, the multi-layered spatial composition. And the fourth one, the continuum of tones and noises and the equality of right given to tones and noises in new music.